of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq rights and established the rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. We are very grateful for our partnerships and our friendships at Dalhousie, grateful for our community leaders, our elders and residents, our Indigenous Advisory Council, our faculty's Indigenous Studies program, and our faculty's new Canada Research Chair in Gender and Reconciliation, Professor Margaret Robinson. We will continue to build on and work on these critically important relationships and friendships. We are all treaty people, and we take these words very seriously. Wikileaks. On July 22nd, 2004, the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks on the United States, commonly referred to as the 9/11 Commission, published its full and complete accounting of the circumstances surrounding the 9/11 attacks. The committee's conclusions were fascinating, and they included the following, quote, "We believe the 9/11 attacks revealed four kinds of failures: in imagination, in policy, in capabilities, in management." The report goes on, quote, "The most important failure was one of imagination. We do not believe leaders understood the gravity of the threat," the report concluded. And the report went on to state at the end, "Imagination is not a gift usually associated with bureaucracies. It is therefore critical, crucial, to find a way to routinize, bureaucratize, and institutionalize the exercise of imagination." Now, the most powerful country on the planet establishes one of the most powerful bipartisan committees in U.S. history. And when that committee prioritizes the need to routinize and bureaucratize the exercise of imagination, it wasn't very difficult to predict the kinds of policies and intelligence gathering strategies the U.S. would adopt to prevent another catastrophic failure. The real crisis today is no longer the failure of imagination, it's the imagination of failure. Seeing potential failures everywhere, at home, globally. Our intelligence agencies were given enormous powers and enormous resources to search for, uncover, and address any imaginable security risk tied to terrorism. Not only from traditional state adversaries, but from individuals. Everybody becomes a suspect in that world, which resulted in hundreds of billions of dollars being invested in security and surveillance and wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The other day I came across a report on statistical probabilities of various threats to the U.S. in a 5-year period. Probability of losing your life in a car crash, but 1 in 19,000. Drowning in a bathtub, but 1 in 800,000. Being struck by lightning, 1 in 5,500,000. Being killed by an act of global terrorism, 1 in 20 million. The probability of being struck by lightning is 4 times as high. 9/11 and overblown threats, that is the essence of the story that we're covering today. It's a story about the abuse of power, the expanding power of governments in the US, Canada, and Europe to compile, process, share, exploit, and manipulate massive volumes of data on personal internet and telephone conversations of its citizens. Beyond gigabytes and terabytes, now petabytes and exabytes of data. I have no clue what those terms refer to, but I think they refer to the collection of billions, if not trillions, of records, all justified by repeated references to some unspecified and expanding national and global security threat. It's a story of court orders directing major telecom and social media companies, Facebook, Google, to circumvent online encryption protocols to release user information to third parties. And it's a story of the public's willingness to relinquish their rights, to relinquish their civil liberties, their freedoms, in exchange for some imagined sense of security, public safety, and protection. In many ways, it's one of the most important stories of our time. And I can't imagine a more important person to tell the story of privacy in the digital age than Edward Joseph Snowden. As many of you already know, Edward Snowden is an American fugitive, a whistleblower, a former CIA employee, and a contractor for the US government working for the US National Security Agency. On May 20th, 2013, Mr. Snowden flew to Hong Kong after leaving his job at the NSA facility in Hawaii. And a month later, in June of 2013, he shared thousands of classified NSA documents with journalists at The Guardian and The Washington Post. His disclosure revealed the NSA's PRISM program, an extensive network of global surveillance programs and operations that went well beyond any credible or reasonable interpretation of the security risks and threats we were facing. And with legal representation from Mr. Robert Thibault, Snowden subsequently applied for refugee status in Hong Kong. When transiting, I believe to Ecuador, when transiting through Moscow, he was restricted to the airport terminal. Surprise, surprise, his passport was canceled. He requested, and Russian authorities granted, a temporary asylum visa for 1 year, and it has been repeated year after year over the last several years. With that context in mind, it's a pleasure for me to introduce you to Mr. Robert Thibault, Ed Snowden's Canadian lawyer, whose work focuses on the areas of human rights, judicial review, and constitutional law. His practice includes criminal trial, commercial, and contract law, and he serves as the director of Vision First, the NGO that provides assistance to asylum seekers in Hong Kong. And Mr. Thibault wanted to offer a few words to introduce his client.
Well, I'd like to thank Dalhousie University for inviting my client, Mr. Snowden, to speak here today and to speak about privacy rights, government, and abuse of government powers. Before I start, I'd just like to mention my connections to Dalhousie University. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Sylvain Charlebois, professor at Dalhousie University, who reached out to me and asked if Mr. Snowden would be interested in speaking here at this event. The second connection to Dalhousie University is a good friend of mine, fellow counsel, retired barrister in Queen's Counsel, John Cameron, who had been practicing law and still resides in Annapolis County. Now, I'd like to focus upon issues that relate to the protections that we need in this world that we're living in today, with the enormous powers, resources, and machinery that governments have, including the technologies they have to spy on us, to use our data, analyze our data, and to use it against us. What we're seeing are democracies electing leaders today that once in their offices are using the tools and the machinery and resources to attack the very institutions of democracy that put them into office. And you're seeing that all over the world. In Europe, you're seeing the leadership in Austria that proceeded on that path. Hungary, in South Asia, India, Southeast Asia, the Philippines. And as a lawyer based in Hong Kong, Canadian lawyer, you're seeing the same thing in Hong Kong. What we're seeing is an attack on rule of law and the erosion of rule of law and the attack on the independence of the judiciaries in democratic jurisdictions around the world. What we're seeing today are governments using their machinery and resources to systematically attack and violate our fundamental human rights. Ill treatment, torture, enforced disappearances, human trafficking, extrajudicial killings, and what we're seeing more and more recently are more incidents of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, I can say that, of course, based on reading the various United Nations special rapporteurs who investigate human rights abuses. But I'm also able to say that as a witness through the eyes of my clients. I have dozens of clients who have suffered persecution at the hands of their governments, and the horrific treatment of ill treatment, torture, attempted extrajudicial killings. Rule of law and the independence of judiciaries and democracies around the world are eroding, in some cases completely disappearing. What we're seeing fundamental to this are the systematic attacks on freedom of expression and political opinion. Political opponents, journalists, lawyers, judges, UN special rapporteurs being targeted and attacked by various governments around the world. And of great significance is the attack on whistleblowers. The whistleblowers like Mr. Snowdon, who made decisions of conscience to disclose in the public interest the egregious and criminal conduct of governments. I'd like to put up a first slide. I have just a few slides that I'd like to share with you. These are also my clients. These are the Snowdon refugees. And I'll go into a little detail on who they are and their relationship with Mr. Snowdon. But there are three families here. And these three families, when Mr. Snowdon was in Hong Kong, after he made disclosures of the NSA activities of electronic mass surveillance around the world, and even on the Five Eyes on civilians, that Mr. Snowdon was at risk of extraordinary rendition. And what I had advised Mr. Snowdon is to raise your refugee claims in Hong Kong, and I'm going to go into the point of international law and refugee law briefly, because that was the first shield Mr. Snowdon had in Hong Kong. That once he raised a refugee claim, there was a legal barrier that would prevent the Hong Kong government or any foreign government to touch Mr. Snowdon. But even with that, at that time, Mr. Snowdon was the most wanted man on the planet. The largest manhunt in human history was launched against Mr. Snowdon, and the world had descended upon Hong Kong like a storm. So what I advised Mr. Snowdon was to go underground, go off the radar, and stay with the refugee community, because he was a refugee claimant at that time. So very briefly, on the left you have Vanessa from the Philippines, and below her is her daughter Kiana, who was born in Hong Kong and stateless. The gentleman next to Vanessa is Ajith, the former soldier with the Sri Lankan army. Beside Ajith is a family of four. Nadika from Sri Lanka, Sapun from Sri Lanka. Sapun on the far side is holding his son Dinath. And then below Nadika is Satandeep. All the children were born in Hong Kong stateless. All these clients opened their doors at various times to Mr. Snowdon to provide him protection. They all saw Mr. Snowdon in the identical situation they had all been in when they were fleeing for their lives and fleeing persecution in their home countries. Now, I mention the Snowdon refugees because it's not just the whistleblowers who are being attacked. It's also those who step forward and protect whistleblowers. In the current and recent two administrations of the US government, there have been more prosecutions, convictions, and lengthy criminal sentences handed down to whistleblowers than in all previous US administrations put all together. What this has done is it has created a chilling effect on anybody daring to expose any given government of their egregious or criminal conduct. What governments are doing at this very time is they're dismantling the rights and freedoms that we all have under constitutional law, but also international law. Governments are increasingly interpreting constitutional law and international law in a way where they avoid responsibility and being held accountable. They're interpreting international law and constitutional law to avoid and deny individuals due process rights. Passing legislation which is in violation of human rights law. We've seen that in Canada. The previous governments who have done exactly that. Violating international human rights law altogether, just blatantly violating them. And more recently, withdrawing from international human rights conventions and covenants, including the International Criminal Court. And specifically what governments are doing now is they are attacking international refugee and asylum law. Okay. One thing about whistleblowers is their ultimate protection is refugee law. Once an individual, a whistleblower, political activist, or a journalist is targeted, persecuted by a government, in fleeing that jurisdiction, if they're granted refugee status, they cannot be deported, they cannot be extradited. It's almost impossible to have that individual persecuted by a government returned. So right now we're seeing governments literally attacking refugee law. For example, the case of Julian Assange, Ecuador has the most sophisticated, complex constitution on the planet. The due process rights provisions are complex, and they're there to safeguard due process rights. Yet President Morales made an arbitrary decision to strip Mr. Assange of his asylum status, which has a very high threshold, and there was no evidential or factual basis to have stripped Mr. Assange of his asylum status. And the second thing that the President of Ecuador did is they denied Mr. Assange all due process rights by saying you have half an hour to leave the Ecuadorian embassy or you'll be taken out by the British police. Another example is the Hong Kong government and Beijing. Ray Wong and Alan Lee, two Hong Kong activists, fled Hong Kong in 2017, and last week the German government confirmed that they had both been granted refugee status based on political persecution by the Hong Kong government. As it turns out, Beijing sent officers from their embassy in Germany directly to attempt to interfere and obstruct the refugee status determination of these two Hong Kong activists. The German government pushed them back. And last week, the Hong Kong government thrashed out at the German government and talking about the extradition of these two activists. But their refugee status shields them. But it doesn't change the fact that those who have made decisions of conscience and those who have supported those persons in making those decisions of conscience by providing humanitarian assistance like the Snowdon refugees, they are being attacked, they are being targeted. The Snowdon refugees, their identities were disclosed in 2016, and from that point onward, the Hong Kong government targeted and persecuted my clients, stripping away humanitarian assistance, arresting witnesses in their cases, and allowing the Sri Lankan police CID to travel to Hong Kong to hunt them down, which happened in December 2016. The next slide, please. This is Vanessa and her daughter at Toronto Pearson International Airport. On May 25th this year, after a 7-year fight, we were successful in bringing the first Snowdon refugee families into Hong Kong, into Canada, and they now reside in Montreal. The Snowdon refugees had made decisions of conscience, ethical, moral decisions to stand before and to support Mr. Snowdon. The remaining 5 Snowdon refugees are still in Hong Kong, and there's a twist with all of this. Firstly, we're at a loss why the Canadian government decided not to bring in all the Snowdon refugees in one go. They form part of a member of a social group, which is one of the grounds under Article 33 of the Refugee Convention, but yet the other 5 are there. If I could have the next slide, please. Kiana, who's now in Montreal, her father is the father of D and D Nath, which is the 3rd Snowdon refugee family. So what Canada has done is they've divided Kiana from her brother and sister and separated Kiana from her father. So we have a situation where one of the Snowdon refugees' families are still left behind in Hong Kong, while the daughter, who has the two siblings, is now free and safe in Canada. So we're asking Canada to act now, to reunite these families. Last week, we filed the Humanitarian and Compassionate Grounds application asking Canada to act now to reunite this family. Without a doubt, Mr. Snowdon's disclosures and discussions and debate that he started in 2013 and has catalyzed is more relevant today than ever before in terms of the enormous resources and technologies of mass surveillance that governments use to control populations, which governments have tried to convince society that such surveillance is there to protect them, and that's a fallacy. If I could have the next slide, please. This is, just would like to mention that this is set in Hong Kong, and she's wanted you to see this image of a little girl who's stateless, who'd like to be reunified with her sister in Montreal. And if I could have the last slide, please. We need donations to continue fighting for these families. And I would ask that whatever you can donate, it will help. And we're hoping to have these families reunified this year in Canada. With that said, I'd like to thank Professor Frank Harvey of Dalhousie, and I'll have him introduce my client, Mr. Edward Snowdon.
If we could bring Mr. Snowdon onto the screen, that would be great. Mr. Snowdon, welcome to Dalhousie University.
I can't hear if I have the stage, but I'll presume that I do. First off, I'd like to thank all of you for inviting me here to speak tonight. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Mr. Robert Thibault for everything that he's done, both for me personally and for the families who gave so much to get me to this point where I could come and speak with you today. I owe them a debt that I'll never be able to repay, and I'm extraordinarily grateful for all the work they've done. With that, I'd like to enter into the general remarks, and I know this has been kind of a somber event, but since it's for the benefit of the families and looking forward toward the future, where they'll all join us in Canada, let's think for a minute about what's happening in our part of the world and what we can do to make it better for everyone. And I think the way we have to begin with that is we have to look back. We have to think about where we came from, and we have to think about how it is that we got here, whatever here is. And I think when we look in the early half of the last century, particularly for students, anybody who's interested in science, in engineering, in law, in literature, this was a structural change in the way our society worked and our understanding of the physical laws of the universe. Scientists and engineers, particularly our technological elite, if you will, became absolutely intoxicated by the rapid advances that we were seeing that day. The developing field of nuclear physics in particular just lit a spark in the imagination of a generation. It promised the potential of clean and cheap energy to just completely revise our understanding of what was possible and how we could even heal people, our work in medicine. But our utopian vision for the future is never guaranteed to be realized. And it was not long until the work of the greatest minds of this generation reached what I call the atomic moment, which is somewhat different from what physicists consider the atomic moment. And this is where this generation corrupted, or rather those in power at the head of this generation corrupted our knowledge, our science, our findings, our tools toward a military purpose. They took our nuclear capability and transformed it into the most horrible weapon that the world had ever witnessed. Today, we're seeing the atomic moment of computer science. Once again, our world is changing, but the difference is that this time, it's happening more quickly, and it's happening more fully. It's not a revolution merely in energy. We're in the midst of the greatest redistribution of power since the Industrial Revolution. And this is happening because technology has provided a new capability that's related to influence. It reaches everyone in every place. It has no regard for borders. Its reach is unlimited, if you will, but its safeguards are not. Now, this technology allows these institutions to monitor and record the private activities of people on a scale that's broad enough that we can say it's close to all-powerful. And it's through the use of new platforms and algorithms that are built on and around these capabilities that they're able to shift our behavior. In some cases, they're able to predict our decisions and also nudge them to different outcomes. And they do this by exploiting the human need for belonging. Right? We don't sign up for this. One of the common arguments is to say, oh, yeah, you said, okay, you understood what I was doing. But how many of you who have a Facebook account actually read the terms of service? Right? Like it's not anything to be ashamed of. You have this for your phone, you have this for every website you sign up to, you have it for your bank, you have it for everything, everywhere, you have it for your university, you have it for access to their own information systems, you have it to get access to the library. Everything has hundreds and hundreds of pages of legal jargon that we're not qualified to read and assess, and yet they're considered to be binding upon us. And it is through this sort of unholy connection of technology and sort of an unusual interpretation of contract law that these institutions have been able to transform this greatest virtue of humanity, which is this desire to interact and to connect and to cooperate and to share, to transform all of that into a weakness. And now these institutions, which are both commercial and governmental, have built upon that and built upon that, and they have structuralized it and entrenched it to where it has become now the most effective means of social control in the history of our species. Maybe you've heard about it, right? This is mass surveillance. When I came forward to reveal the first system of global, truly global mass surveillance back in 2013, which was being run not just by the United States government, but actually a real-life conspiracy, as hard as that is to believe. It's a real thing. It's in government documents. You can look at it online. Even the White House has refused to deny it. Of a group called the Five Eyes. These are the Anglophone governments, which would be the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. And the revelation of this activity, which functioned, for those of you who don't recall, excuse me, by working with companies, right? This was a collaboration between corporate and government power. And government in the United States, this began under the Bush administration and was embraced and extended by Obama, and it's continued to get worse under the current administration. They would go to the largest web platforms in our country and in your country and everywhere else. Each government would go to their own. And they would try to induce them into willful cooperation, in most cases beyond what the law required, by appealing to a sense of patriotism or a desire to increase public safety. And where that wouldn't work, in many other cases, coercion. And they would get these groups to act as agents of government, be able to hand over your entire Gmail account, everything you've ever typed into Facebook, clicked on Facebook, every site you've ever gone to, where you're logged into Facebook, but it just has that like button on the page. All of that was recorded, right? And it was poured into a system that didn't just touch internet connections, but it touched phone calls and everything else. And this is a global heat map of where the surveillance was happening most intensely, just from the US part of the operation. So unfortunately, this doesn't reflect Canada's numbers. But you see some unusual things here. You see stuff that wouldn't surprise you. You see the war zone is sort of red hot. And you see China is getting closer red. Red means more surveillance. Right? But an unusual thing is you would see a traditional adversary like Russia is actually less intensely monitored than the United States itself. You see Germany is being intensely surveilled, things like that, traditional allies. And this surprised a lot of people because we'd constantly been told this was for our own good, it was for our own protection. And the only reason we weren't told about this was because if we knew, people would die. But when you actually looked at top secret documents, and all of these materials were classified